Bruckner Chase. I'm so glad to have you on the show today. This is such an important topic at such an important time of year. And for maybe people that don't realize that they are the target audience that needs to learn about this, we're talking about ocean safety. And, you and I go way back at this point. I feel like I've talked to you so much about this, but kind of on a personal level, like we've gone swimming together and I've learned a lot from you in the ocean. So I want you to share your knowledge with our listeners today too, and kind of talk about what we need to know going into spring break, because that is coming up.
Yes,
Tell me a little bit about you first and your background and what it is you do.
It's always a loaded but exciting question. I used to work on the more corporate side of things, and then a while back, I got pulled into doing some stuff with the part of NOAA that oversees our special marine sanctuary areas, marine protected areas, national marine sanctuaries. And that led me to doing some work in American Samoa, where we were hoping, or one of the goals was to connect people to these amazing places, American Samoa being one of them, but also help make people more confident and comfortable in the water. In American Samoa, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure to teach swimming lessons and have people become more proficient at actually moving through the water and stuff. So we were down there sharing some tools so that when they're on a beach by themselves with no lifeguards or no one else around, they can make good decisions to protect themselves and protect family. And jump forward 15 years, kind of like we're talking about right now, that people heading to a beach on spring break, how do we give them the tools and the decision-making processes to keep themselves safe? So when I moved away from my corporate gig, I pretty much dove straight into all this ocean life. So really kind of connecting communities to our oceans where, the tag phrase where weather, water, waves, and people meet. So that every experience at the beach is positive. So our foundation works on making ocean opportunities more accessible to everyone, especially those with special physical needs, as well as keeping everyone who may be looking out over a body of water in an open water environment or in the natural environment, helping them assess what's going on in front of them, translate what they're seeing to what their capacity might be in the water, which is really important. As we know, what swimming means to me may not mean the same to someone who's really hasn't spent a lot of time in the ocean or in the open water. Kind of building that common experience so that ideally we can prevent dangerous situations from happening. So that is what I'm focused on all the time with friends like you and partners with NOAA, as we're looking at creating a new film series called Blue IQ, specifically to make people smarter around the ocean. So this is going to be a fun conversation between the two of us.
I have a lot of stuff I want to talk about, and I know that we're going to focus kind of on rip currents today, but and you've taught me this, there's so much more going on in the ocean beyond rip currents. So can you give me some go over some of the hazards? We have rip currents, but can you talk about some of the other stuff that's happening in the ocean that can be really problematic?
I think let's take a step up. You and I have talked, being from a meteorologist background and me working with Weather Service and the environment of the ocean. And I think one of the things we really want to talk about too is the social science side of this. And really, one of the most dangerous things in the ocean may be us. If we do not really know how to understand what's going on out there, the decisions we make may make a situation more dangerous. And I think that we want to make it so that sometimes people make the decision it's not a good day to go into the water, and really looking at the individual, the social side of what is really dangerous in the water. I'm an ocean lifeguard and experienced open water swimmer. So what might be risky to me might be deadly, or what might not be a risk to me could be deadly to someone else. And I think that some of the things that are out there, when we can talk about submerged objects and changing tides and then changing and not understanding the bottom contour, going into the water near jetties or piers where there's swirling currents or where the weather may be impacting the nearshore environment. All of those are physical elements, but how we decide whether or not we should be out there or not, which is kind of a social question, is really what makes things either dangerous or safe, I think.
Okay, so let's say it's spring break and you and a bunch of your friends are on the beach, you're enjoying some cocktails. How do you educate yourself and the people around you when you're in a situation like that? How does a college student stand up and say, hey guys, I don't think we should go in the water right now?
Yeah.
That's a kind of a tough outlier position to be in.
It's an outlier, but like we're talking about spring break, it's like that's going to be the bulk of the people down at the beach. I've got a sister who is playing chaperone to 15 young women from college who are at a beach house down on the Florida Panhandle, and so the decisions each one of them makes really is going to shape how safe they are out in the ocean. I think that one of the things is recognizing that there are situations out there that we don't necessarily understand. And one of the things that we say is we say, if in doubt, don't go out. And really that it requires that, how well do you think you can swim? So what we're working on now is really telling people, if you don't know, don't go. Like if you don't know what the conditions are and how good of a swimmer you are, don't go out there. And always the first reference point, if you're going to a new location or a beach you haven't been to before, or you're a freshman and you're going to Florida for the first time with friends, the place to swim is always going to be in front of a lifeguard, always going to be the first choice. But also knowing that sometimes spring break, well before summer, there may not be as many lifeguards on duty, or some lifeguard agencies may not be up and running depending on where you are. But finding local information, not a weather forecast that covers that area, but specific for that beach, knowing the tides, knowing the forecast for that specific location, not necessarily an airport that's 20 miles away, but for that beach and that location there, so that you know what's coming and know what's in front of you and what might change during the course of the day, and know that, sometimes it's better to stay on the sand. But if you don't know,
Is there value in like going in up to your knees? Like
yeah,
go just kind of chill in the water and enjoy it, but don't go out where you could get more hurt.
absolutely. And I think it's always a good idea to kind of err on the side of reducing the risk. And knowing also that, when I was in college, I was gonna push the envelope. I was gonna go out and do stuff. I wanted to have fun. I wanted to go play in the waves. So we know that that's kind of a default for spring break. We want to go out, we want to have fun, we want to play in that. And I think that what you talk about, staying knee deep, staying where you can touch, and really being aware. And this is important, situational awareness, knowing that the ocean environment is dynamic. It might have changed from the year before if you always go back to the same place. And know that you may be able to stand up right here, but if you move 20 yards to your right, it may be deeper. There may be a hole there. There could be a rip current there, what we were talking about. There could be a gap in the sandbar, and all of a sudden you're standing and you're fine, you're popping up over waves, and then all of a sudden one wave picks up and there's a current that kind of takes you along the beach. All of a sudden now you come down and your feet don't touch the bottom. And knowing that that can happen because it's a dynamic environment. It's not, you know, planned out like the pool is, where there's a very gradual decline from the shallow end to the deep end. There could be rocks, there could be jellyfish, there could be stuff that's not expected. And if you end up in an unexpected situation, we also tell people the most important thing you can bring with you into the ocean is a calm state of mind. So if you are, wow, this isn't what I expected, we usually tell people, and it's easier said than done, try to stay calm, relax, signal to someone else, look and see which direction the current's taking you, where are the waves, and try to navigate back to a safe place.
Yeah, stay calm is that's a tough one. It's like when your
Yeah,
spouse
and,
tells you
and
to
you and
stay calm,
I,
right?
yeah. You and I were out off the beach in Myrtle Beach in situations that were a little intimidating. And I think staying calm, like we said, easier said than done. I think we had some other meteorologists went out with us that were like, yeah, this is a little bit scary. And we weren't out in rip currents. That was just the waves and the wind. And it was just a torn up swash zone, that area near the shore where the waves wash up and back out again.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because so you did this course where you took a bunch of meteorologists out
Hmm.
into the ocean, kind of taught us how to read the ocean, what to look for, some safety things. And there was like this safety in numbers thing that first day, right?
Yeah.
And we're out there
Yeah.
and I felt totally safe. I felt great. You had like multiple people with like flotation devices around. I was like, this is a piece of cake. Then a couple days later, you're like, well, let's go swim. Your wife
Yeah.
and me
Famous last words
and
coming
you
from
we
me. Yeah.
all went swimming and that was a lot more intimidating. It felt different to me at that point. There were less of us, we were farther out, we were head down in the water, and also like I didn't have a good grasp on like where we were going. I consider myself a strong swimmer. So I can only imagine for somebody who maybe isn't a strong swimmer, what that must be like. But I also have questions for you, and I don't want to generalize genders, but you talk about people and how in spring break you were out there kind of just like going for it. I see a huge difference when it comes to men and women taking risks in the water, and I'm curious if that translates statistically to incidents that you deal with.
Yeah, it is. I think that so my wife Michelle, who you met, who was part of that class taking everyone out, she's an accomplished swimmer, very experienced around the oceans and all over the world. And she's also a social scientist and looks at in her research was looking at adolescent brain development. And I'm don't mean to downplay our college friends, but people from mid-teens up to mid-20s and looking at how risk-taking manifests itself, decision making hits, and then is there a change in what kind of risk-taking behavior there is? And yes, there is. If you look at the social science studies, there is more of a risk-taking element, usually with males rather than females, but also just with the neurological brain development, that frontal decision-making part of the brain that we're more prone to take risks before the age of about 22 or 23. And then that decision making process matrix starts to kind of temper down some of that risk taking behavior. So, yes, there is a male and female component, and there can be outliers. There can be exceptions to that. There can be learned traits where a woman may be more of a risk taker than a male counterpart standing right next to her. But then also, as we get older, that risk taking decision making changes as well. So, with younger people, if you're a parent and you're worried about whether or not your 18-year-old is going to make the same wise decisions that you do, chances are they won't. And it's really just kind of the way as we kind of evolve and learn about our environment, we take risks to assess where we are in that environment and what happens. In this instance, it might be the ocean, and it might be something innocuous as going out to play in the waves when they're maybe a little bit bigger than we're comfortable with. And I think that really knowing who we are as a person, that situational awareness of what's out there, but then translating it into what do I know about myself and my swimming ability. And we're really excited in this new film series we're working on with Noah. We're using college athletes and we're filming them in their field of play, on the court, on the field, wherever they are the masters of their athletic domain. And these are extremely fit. These are college athletes that have really mastered their sport to play at this level. But then when it comes to going out in the ocean, it's like, wow, I don't know this environment. It's very, very different. And no matter how fit and strong and experienced you may be as a high school or college athlete or someone who's really fit and really strong in a land-based activity, it may not translate into an ocean environment. And that's the same for swimmers as well, like what you were talking about. You swim as a regular exercise, where you live. You go to the pool all the time. You and I have talked about swimming, but out in the ocean, where there isn't a wall or a marker on the depth and all of that. And if you look at information from the American Red Cross, more than 50% of Americans state that they could not pass some of the basic swim requirements for an American Red Cross swimming test, which is keeping their head above water and swimming maybe 25 meters. So if you're looking at getting pulled out in a rip current or even needing to navigate back to shore, you could have to swim 200 meters without a wall, without even knowing when you're going to get to safety because you can't tell just from assessing that. So it's really important that we know what we know about the ocean, but then also, as much as we can, develop self-awareness for what could we or can we do if we're in a dangerous situation.
And it's interesting you say 200 meters. For me, I think, okay, well, that's nothing. I do that no problem all the time. But there is such a huge difference in swimming 200 meters panicked versus
Yes.
not panicked. Like that calm 200 meters, no problem.
Hmm.
But like when we were out swimming in the ocean, and I'm not an open water swimmer by any means, it was exhausting. And we went so much of a shorter distance than what I'm used to.
Yeah, and most people have a hard time. It's hard to estimate distance across the water
Yeah.
because you look across, the field. I'm looking out the window here. You know how tall a stop sign is, or you know how tall a fire hydrant is. So you can judge distance based on familiar objects. But when you're looking out across the ocean and there's no element there, it's like, is that 100 meters offshore or is that half a mile offshore? Those reference points are gone, so it's harder to really judge. And when you're standing on the dunes or on the sand and you're, 5 feet, 6 feet tall, your eyes are up over and you're looking down at the water, it's a lot different than when you're looking back towards the beach and the water's right here.
Hmm.
And it doesn't take much more than about a 10-mile-an-hour wind that's blowing towards the beach or along the beach to now create a really turbulent, white-capped surface of the water that's going to be so much harder than most people expect to swim through and to get your face up above the water to breathe. It's not going to be like it was swimming at the pool indoors in the city where you came from.
I was talking to the National Hurricane Center not too long ago, and they have repeatedly brought up the fact that they're working so much on mortality rates and preventing death when it comes to hurricanes. And one thing that they're still struggling with is rip currents. And so they're still losing people in rip currents as much as they are getting the message out about these other hazards in a hurricane. That's something they're struggling with. So I'm curious, especially with Michelle being the social scientist, what's the answer there? You're working with NOAA, but how can we get people to understand the dangers more?
I think it's important that they understand the dangers of that nearshore environment that's impacted by even offshore hurricanes. They're going to be creating, short period waves, perhaps. The wind that might be associated with that storm is going to make the surface of the water really difficult to navigate. Depending upon what the contour of the bottom is, or jetties or piers, any water that's flowing around from a swell that's coming from the hurricane or something that's generated by the wind is going to make really difficult to read and understand currents. There may be a rip current that is kind of traditional to what NOAA's Rip Current Survival Guide talks about, that's flowing straight out, and you can see that, but there might be longshore currents or feeder currents or flash rip currents. So we're already naming 2 or 3 different types of currents or rip currents, and people go, well, how do I understand all that? How do I know? And the answer is, unless you are at the ocean all the time, I'm a professional ocean lifeguard as well. So I see this, it's part of my daily life. And you cannot learn to read this and understand it and see it unless you really are there all the time.
Hmm.
Going to that sports analogy, a running back or a wide receiver who's experienced and at the top of their game, they know how to read the field. They know how to read the defenders. They know how to get through it. If you told me to run a pass pattern or run a ball to the end zone, I would be lost. I would not be able to assess it and figure out where to go and what to do. And I think with what the Hurricane Center is talking about, and we have hurricanes come up along the mid-Atlantic where I am here, and they make very turbulent, unpredictable, hard to read conditions. And what we need to know is, even in the basic rip current survival guide, they tell you to relax, which is tough to do, as we talked about, when you've got waves and wind and all this stuff hitting you and you're trying to stay afloat. And then they say, well, we'll swim perpendicular to the current or swim out of the current and then back in. But if you're pulled 75 meters out and now you've got to swim along the beach and now you've got to swim back in, navigating, now you're in breaking waves that are driving you under. That amount of just distance to swim is beyond what most people can do. And when you add in the fact that you might be holding your breath because you're being held on by the waves, or there might be jetties or hazards that now you have to navigate around, it's already putting people in a situation where it's just not realistic that most people will be able to get through that. And I think that the most important thing we can do is make it cool or make it peer acceptable to not go in the water. If you don't know, don't go, because my experience, not only am I an ocean lifeguard, but we also, like you guys, we took a bunch of meteorologists out for a swim in the ocean. And in order to do that safely, we had my wife, an experienced ocean person who's worked with people all over on getting them comfortable in the ocean, myself, who's an EMT and professional ocean lifeguard, and our other friend helping us keep it safe is a retired Coast Guard rescue swimmer who's jumped into probably some of the most challenging ocean conditions any of us would ever see. And so that's what we did to make sure 9 people were safe in a pretty rough offshore condition with the wind and the waves. And I think that unless you have that kind of crew with you, it might be a good day to stay close in, because even like we were talking about earlier on, going out knee deep, But if the swell is 2 to 4 feet, you can get knocked off your feet pretty quickly if a wave comes through and then get pulled out into a situation that you're not expecting. But I think that as tough it is, and we talked about risk-taking behavior and wanting to be out there, we really want to stress that there may be another day to go out in the ocean, but this day, based on what you see in front of you, may be the day to hang out on the sand, go back to the balcony and watch the waves, and then come back in a day or two.
Hmm.
Tough to do, but I think that realistically, most people, according to Red Cross and everything else, would not be able to swim the distance they'd need to. And we take a group of masters athletes out for ocean swims in the summer in the Jersey Shore, and we've been doing it for 18 years now. So every week we take a group of people out to train. And these are people that are experienced swimmers, triathletes, open water swimmers. And we have probably had to assist more experienced swimmers back to shore when situations are a little bit dicey or beyond what they expected than we've had to like rescue people just on a normal beach day. So there's no guarantee that just because you can swim, you can't get rattled. And
Hmm.
it's been my experience over almost 2 decades that the ocean can be an intimidating, scary place. And it's better to kind of err on the side of this could be dangerous and this could be dicey. And I don't want to cut my spring break short.
Going back to the thing about the Hurricane Center, I'm curious if, I can't imagine there's like an easy way to track if an incident is rip current related or something else. Do you think that things get lumped into that category of rip current, and that's kind of like just that general ocean hazard category when we call like a rip current incident? Do you think that there's other stuff happening there too?
Yes, absolutely. I think that based on our experience in and around the ocean for a long period of time, there are rip currents, and they can be dangerous, especially not necessarily if they're moving really fast, but if they're subtle. So now you're getting pulled out further than you expect, and it happens so slowly you didn't see it happening. If you look at research or data that Surf Lifesaving Australia puts out, they have a very robust network of about 300 plus surf lifesaving clubs around Australia, very standardized in how they assess situations, how they rescue, how they set up. And what they found is only about 50% of the fatalities are related directly to rip currents. And they normally are assessing that based on more or very reliable first person observation of what happened. And I think too often when we see something that here in the US where someone says, oh, it was a rip current, often that's someone who wasn't on the beach at that time assigning what they think happened. And I know I have seen some fatalities or non-fatal drownings and looked back at ocean conditions. It was attributed to a rip current, and it may have been, but I also look at the coastal forecast at that time, and often I've seen winds that were 20 miles an hour blowing along the shore, probably creating really dangerous cross beach currents, looking at short period, like really fast waves coming in that were 3 to 4 feet in height. So I'm looking at, yes, the news article says it was a rip current, and it may have been. I wasn't there. But I also know for a fact that the weather forecasting office's near shore conditions would have made it challenging for me to even swim through. Like it would have made for a really dicey and dangerous near shore swash zone condition based on just wind and swells and all of that. And I think some people may get into trouble even before maybe they end up in a rip current that then pulls them out.
Do you think that's problematic? Do you think that we're putting too much emphasis on rip currents because we're categorizing them as that way when people maybe should be looking out for other things?
Yes, and I think it's really important for anyone communicating about coastal safety to recognize, yes, there are rip currents. And if we know it was a rip current, telling people how to get out of a rip current is important. We know that a lot of people may not be able to swim, but they need to swim perpendicular to the current and then navigate back in. That's important. But there was an instance earlier last year where someone was rescued and they were almost a half a mile offshore. I don't remember the exact distances, but they were a half mile offshore. And the original news reports said they were caught in a rip current. And I was asked to look into this by a broadcaster, and we wanted to talk about this on air. And it turns out that this person went into the water at an inlet between one of the barrier islands and a large inland body of water that was flowing out into the ocean. And they went out right at this point at that inlet during an outgoing tide. And so what they were caught in was an outgoing tidal current that took them a quarter to a half mile offshore. Here at the Jersey Shore and even on the Florida Panhandle, you'll have barrier islands and then gaps between those islands where the intercoastal, that water flows out on an outgoing tide. Here, we may have a 4 to 5 foot tidal change, and the tides here occur every 6 hours. So if there's an outgoing tide and it's changing 4 feet in height in 6 hours, that current's moving so fast that no one can swim against it for more than a few seconds. And it will take you way offshore, well beyond easily being able to swim back in again. So we began with that friend messaging about tidal currents and inlets. And so they added identifying these gaps between the islands that these tidal currents could pull you out. Don't go swimming where you know this flow is going to be really big there. Also in the Pacific Northwest, there was a drowning that was attributed to a rip current, where really in the Pacific Northwest, if you are going to the beach to walk around and just look at the tide pools and explore that nearshore environment, they have sneaker waves, which are larger ocean waves that come much further up the beach than most people are experiencing as they're walking along. They may travel 100 meters further up the beach and then sweep everything in their path back out into the ocean. In the Pacific Northwest, that sneaker wave is now pulling you out into water that may be 54 degrees. So it probably wasn't a rip current, but if it was that they eventually got into, now you're fully clothed in jeans and a jacket in 54-degree water where you may not even have a beach to swim back to because it's a cliff right next to where you got pulled out to. So I think it's really important for meteorologists and communicators to go, if it was a rip current, this is how you get out of a rip current. If it was a tidal current, there was this. If it was Pacific Northwest and a sneaker wave, this is how you get out of that, because the goal should always be, how do we stop this incident from happening again? And we give them good information for that instance, then we get to prevent it from happening the next time.
Sometimes I feel like people don't get it until they know someone or see something really bad happen. So I hate to bring up awful things, but you're a lifeguard. You have been for a long time. Is there any incident that you've been involved in that you want to share with us that might get that point across of just how dangerous things can be, even if they don't seem like they're going to be?
Yeah, one thing I get to talk about this a lot now, and before the age of 10, I was rescued from drowning twice. And the first time I was probably 5 or 6 years old, I fell off a dock into a lake by a marina. And this was after I'd had swim lessons in a pool. Like, I'd had swim lessons when I was 4 or 5, but then at 6 or 7, I fell off. And swim lessons help. It's important that everyone have access to learn how to swim. But what's also really important, and we see some countries like Canada focusing not on teaching someone how to swim competitive strokes, but survival swimming. What do you do if you end up in the water when you didn't mean to be there? If you didn't walk down the steps of a pool or jump off the side of a pool, but fell off of a dock or fell off of a jetty? And that happened in a lake environment, and then also in a pool environment. I was holding onto a float. Someone pulled the float away from me. I went straight to the bottom. I can remember being on that bottom and not being able to do anything to get my head back above the water. A lifeguard jumped in and brought me back up again. That was over 40 years ago, and I remember that feeling and that experience. As a lifeguard, I have had a couple of rescues that were a little bit dicey, and these were ones that happened after hours. I was out training at an inlet, like we described a minute ago, and I had swum back into the beach, and all of a sudden someone at the end of the jetty near us was waving and yelling, and it was two fishermen. One of them had slipped on the rocks and fallen in with an outgoing tide, and he was being swept straight out into the ocean. And I was with my wife. She was on a board. She was already back at the beach. I made the decision to swim out to him to try to stay with him and keep him calm while she came out and brought the board. So sure enough, as soon as I get close to him, this person's trying to grab me because I'm the one that's afloat and I was going to keep him from drowning. So absolute complete panic and being swept out into the ocean. Controlled him and kept him calm. My wife comes up, brings a board up. As a lifeguard, I know how to get someone on board and not put myself in risk. And then we had to paddle probably 200 or 300 meters down the coast and then back in through the surf to get him back in. And had we not been there, it would not have ended very well. And that was someone who had no intention of going in the water. They were out fishing on a jetty. They fished at, I had no idea how many times before. It wasn't a new environment for them. But things happened and they weren't prepared. And I think that in Australia, that happens a lot. And they talk about having fishermen out on jetties, have life preservers with them or life jackets with them. So if they do fall in, they can activate that. But, that's one experience that comes to mind because I can remember swimming out to that individual, looking in their eyes and seeing absolute panic and fear. And without me being there, that would have escalated. And I don't know how much longer they would have been able to stay above the water.
I know we're strapped for time, so I want to just get to a couple more things before I let you go. One of them, biggest misconceptions when it comes to water safety. What do you see floating around out there in the media and social media that we are just getting wrong when it comes to ocean safety?
We ask people if they can swim, and we don't recognize that being able to swim is a subjective assessment. And I think you may remember one of the first times I talked to the group of meteorologists, we said, how many of you can swim? And everyone raises their hand. And then we showed a video of someone swimming in a remote area of the Pacific with huge waves and stuff going over all over the place. And I go, okay, now how many could swim through this? And like no hands go up. And I think one of the most important things we can do is we cannot tell people to get out of a rip current, just float on your back and then swim in, because we need to recognize that swimming in a pool where you learned how to swim or in a controlled environment is a lot different than swimming in dynamic conditions where you might need to swim 2 or 3 times further than you've ever swum before. And I think it's really important that we recognize the social science side of things. And let's not assume that swimming means the same thing for everyone. For instance, I was a college swimmer at Rice University. If I tell you I'm going to the ocean to go swimming, that means I'm going to go into the water and swim a substantial distance down the beach and back again. Many other people may go, I'm going to the beach to go swimming. And what they mean is they're just going to go play in the waves. So I define that word for me differently than someone else. And I think that we cannot assume that when we say, make sure you know how to swim, as universally applied to I'm going to be safe in the ocean, because what we need to do is know how to swim in a way that is compatible with the conditions that are right out in front of you and know how to understand how to connect those two.
Yeah, I had an ego check that day in Myrtle Beach for sure.
A lot of people do.
Knocked down
And
in the way that swash zone, it got me, knocked me down, took some water up the nose and I was glad I had goggles on because it was like, at least it wasn't in my eyes too.
Yeah. And it can be really scary and intimidating. And I've done a lot of things in the ocean in different parts of the world and stuff. I still get afraid. And there are still times where I know I need to not go out or I need to go back in again. And this is one instance where ego doesn't win against the ocean.
Okay, so now that you've thoroughly scared me and perhaps everybody listening, I want to know how to have a good relationship with the ocean. If you have a fear, if you are someone who's like, no, I think I'm never going in again after all this, how do we have that good relationship with the ocean? How do we enjoy it safely and feel good about getting in the water?
The ocean is an amazing place to be. And keep in mind, I started this career working with national marine sanctuaries where I was around some of the most special ocean places in the world. American Samoa, they have lived on that island and been in those ocean waters for 3,000 years. It's an intimate, amazing connection to amazing places. And, people get afraid of sharks or get afraid of one thing or another. And I often tell people too, some of our rookie lifeguards, that sometimes the scariest thing out in the ocean is what we bring with us in our own heads. So what I always tell people is a healthy amount of respect is more important. So respect the ocean. Always respect the ocean. And, we talked about if you don't know, don't go, but it's an amazing place. If you want to spend time there, kind of like if you want to learn how to scuba dive and see amazing underwater reefs and stuff, you don't go out and buy a scuba tank and then go off the beach. You go and sign up for scuba lessons and you learn how to do it safely. And then you buy the equipment and you go out and you have these amazing experiences. And I would suggest taking that same approach to learning how to do whichever you want to do at the ocean. Let's say you want to learn how to surf. Sign up for a lesson, have someone who's experienced with it, teach you how to read the waves, how to read the water. We take adults out in the ocean all the time. We teach them how to read the waves and what to do to get through the ocean safely. There's some great resources in NOAA's Wave Safe series where we show people how to enter and exit the water, going underneath the waves, cutting through the waves, how to understand that. So those film series, there's one for the Pacific Northwest, one for California, the East Coast, that'll help you kind of understand certain things. But the ocean is an amazing place. Going to the beach is an amazing way to spend spring break. And if you do it and just make sure that you're self-aware and then aware of the changing environment and respect it all the time, it's a blast. And you can take those risks because you understand how to get back to shore.
Cool. Is there
Yeah.
anything else you want to share, Bruckner, about the ocean and staying safe this spring?
I think what's also really important, we talked about rip currents and how people get into trouble. One of the things that is a real issue, and the Hurricane Center may or may not have brought this up, is second victim drownings. We also call it drowning for love, where a friend or a son or a daughter or a parent is in trouble in the ocean, and the emotional response is charge out and save them. And then too often, would-be rescuer ends up being the one that drowns, or sadly, both people end up experiencing a fatal drowning. So take a look at NOAA's WaveSafe Take 10, which is basically a call to action. Pause for 10 seconds before you go charging out of the water. Call 911, activate an emergency response. See if you can help someone from shore, help them stay calm, get them to stay relaxed until professional rescuers arrive. But I would never, even as a lifeguard, charge out into the water without having a flotation device or a plan in place that I can protect myself first to save someone else. And I'm someone that does this professionally.
10 seconds must feel like a lifetime when you're in that situation, though.
It does. But even if you watch a lifeguard responding on the stand, they will call it in over the radio. They will blow a whistle. They will get people out of the water. We'll take that 10 seconds before we go out into the ocean because we want to make sure we bring everyone back in, including ourselves.
Bruckner Chase, thank you so much for all this information today. Hopefully it does some good and helps some people heading out to spring break.
Fantastic. Great to be here.
Greg, you are kind of the expert when it comes to all things rip currents, and I feel like we've talked a lot over the years about different advancements when it comes to rip current science, but I want to go back to the basics. Can you tell me, for people who maybe aren't scientists, like the basics of what causes an actual rip current?
Yeah, rip currents are caused by waves. So anywhere you have breaking waves, you can have rip currents. And so that means, along all your ocean coastlines, of course, but then also in the Great Lakes, which a lot of people don't think about. And they're caused by the variability in how waves are breaking along shore. And so the typical way that might happen is when you have a sandbar near the beach, right? I'm sure people have gone to the beach, know that, you kind of go out a little bit, you see kind of a shallower area where the sand builds up somewhat close to shore. Well, that sandbar changes how waves are breaking. And so if you sit there and watch at the beach for a while, you'll notice that waves tend to break more over the bar, and that's because the water's shallower there. Whereas what you will often have is you have a bar and then you might have a channel in it, so a deeper spot in the bar. And where you have that channel, it's deeper, and so then waves aren't breaking. And what ends up happening is where you have waves breaking, you have something shoreward of where the waves break. So they break, and then shoreward of that, the water level rises. And if you've been at the beach, you notice this because you'll see when a wave breaks, right, then the water kind of pushes up shore. And if you do that over a few different breaking waves, you end up with higher water levels where waves are breaking more. And then in those channel areas where it's deeper and the waves really aren't breaking as much, the water level is lower. And so as everyone knows, right, water wants to flow downhill. So it tends to flow from those areas of high breaking waves to low and then offshore and forming a rip current. And that's kind of one of the more common ones caused by the shape of the bottom, but you can cause similar changes in breaking waves by structures. So they often occur near jetties or piers. And then sometimes even when you have just waves, and it could be a flat bottom, but waves might come from different angles, say one from the south, one out of the north, and then they kind of intersect near shore, and that can set up those same kind of variations in breaking waves that you get from like bathymetry or the shape of the bottom. But those we call transient rips because they can come and go. They can be there for a few minutes or even a few seconds and then go away, and they can move along shore. And so those can be especially dangerous, but in the end, it's all about breaking waves.
Okay. What about weather? You're hitting it from below. What about from above? Does that impact it?
Yeah. So of course, weather's important in particular, in terms of driving those waves. So, when you have strong winds over the ocean for an extended period of time, you start building up your waves. And so then, the bigger the waves, generally speaking, the stronger the rip currents. But I think what people need to remember is that you don't necessarily need to have the weather right where you are, right? So you might have a hurricane hundreds and hundreds of miles away, making really big waves, but then where you are, it could be really nice and no wind at all. But those waves come from where that hurricane is, they travel to you. And so you can have a perfectly nice sunny day, but pretty big waves, and then still have hazardous rip currents. So I think it's often a misconception that people think if it's, nice outside, they might not have to worry about it. But those can actually be the most dangerous times because that's when people are at the beach in the water and potentially exposed to the hazard.
Yeah, those offshore hurricanes, certainly. What about high tide versus low tide? Does that matter? Is it more likely to get them one or the other?
Yeah, the tide plays a role, and often it's at low tide. So, going back to, again, when you have the shape of the bottom influencing rip currents, at low tide, that sandbar is pretty close to the water surface, let's say. And so waves are really breaking over it pretty in a pronounced way, really causing those alongshore changes in breaking waves. You could have that same location a few hours later at high tide, and the waves, it's deep enough over the bar that the waves aren't breaking at all. They just break right on shore. And then you can have no rip currents. So you can have times at the beach where, you might show up in the morning, it's at high tide, there's no rip currents, you think it's safe. Well, a few hours later, the tide drops, waves start breaking over that sandbar, and you could have a really strong rip and a potential hazard. So things can change rapidly, and the tide is definitely one of the reasons why.
Okay, so this is scary. How are people currently getting their information when they go to the beach to learn about rip currents? How is that information going out there to warn the public?
So one of the primary ways is through the National Weather Service and through NOAA. And so, we use a rip current model that predicts the likelihood of hazardous rip currents every hour, about every mile or so along shore. And that goes out 6 days into the future. And so it can tell you, how likely you are to have that hazard at your particular beach. And then our weather forecasters, which are in the weather forecast office throughout the US, take that model information and then issue guidance in a rip current forecast from it. And so, when you can go to your local forecast office page, or you can go to weather.gov/beach, and that will show you what your likelihood is in the coming days. And then also, of course, we work with our partners, with our meteorologists throughout the country and local news, and that information gets to people in a whole bunch of different ways.
Gotcha. Okay. And then there's some new technologies that have been worked on over the past few years. I know when I spoke with you and your colleague, Alex, I think his name was, you were working on the use of cameras that were set up along the beaches to detect rip currents via AI. Can you give me a brief overview, reminder of how that works?
Yeah. So one of the challenges with rip currents is being able to measure them because, you would like to be able to go put a sensor in the water, but at the beach, that's really hard to do because, big waves, the sand's moving around. You can put it in there and it could be completely covered a few days later. So we can't really use traditional oceanographic methods to capture rips. And so for a lot of our work, we've relied on lifeguards. Lifeguards are human observers, and they out of anyone can really spot when there's a rip current. And so we've been partnering with a bunch of great lifeguarding agencies throughout the years, and they've collected data for us about when rip currents are happening or when they're not. And that's the primary data source we've used to be able to train our models. But obviously that's not ideal because lifeguards have other things to do at the beach, right? And they're not always there. They're only there, in some places in the summertime and during the day. And so we wanted to find other ways we could collect information about when and where rip currents were occurring. And one way you can do that is through cameras. And a lot of people are probably familiar with webcams. If you've gone surfing or if you go to the beach and stay at your hotel, it probably has a webcam showing you the beach. And so they're everywhere. And what we wanted to do was see if we could use that camera imagery to tell us when a rip current was occurring. And so we've done that in a few different ways now, but we're using AI in all of them. But the one that we're kind of first developed and the one that we have running at a few cameras right now is using object detection. So much like a lot of people are familiar with this now, you use your phone and you want to find pictures that have your dog in it or your cat in it, right? Your phone's using object detection to figure out what images those are and where your dog is in the image. And sometimes it puts like a box around it or something. Well, we can do the same thing with rip currents. We've trained a model by going through manually and labeling boxes around thousands of pictures of rip currents. And then we can use that information to train an AI model to tell us when there's a rip current in a picture and then in a video by combining a bunch of frames in a video together. And so it basically just puts a bounding box around a rip current if it sees it. And we've been testing it out, and it works pretty well in some cases. And we're working on trying to improve it moving forward.
And when I spoke to you guys last, there was talk of one day in the future, there might be an app. Now enter RipFinder. So I'm curious, can you tell me about that? Because I think the first thought process is like, this is going to save lives, but is it also kind of a crowdsourcing tool?
Yeah, so once we started with it using webcams, because webcams are pretty easy in terms of dealing with the data because they're stationary. We can collect video over an extended period of time. And it makes it easier to deal with that data. But once our team and really the team at UC Santa Cruz was on the lead on this, once they developed a method that could be done on cameras, it was like, okay, well, where else can we use this? And we've done it on drones and done it with mobile devices. So using the same kind of approach of kind of that object detection approach I was talking about before, you can take your phone, you can hold it up to the beach in real time, and it will show you where it thinks a rip current is, putting a little box around it. We've been testing it out with users in California. California Sea Grant's been helping us out with that as well, and some lifeguard groups to be able to test it. And it's showing pretty good performance. And what we would like to do is, I think, not necessarily use it for, people shouldn't be making public safety life-saving choices based off the app. But what we want to do is try to give a way for people to see a rip current and then be able to understand what that looks like in real life. So if they're standing there at the beach, okay, these are features I need to be worried about, and hopefully just have another way to reach people while they're at the beach and give them more information about what a rip current looks like and how they can identify them.
Cool. So it's kind of in the testing phase now. Is there a thought process timelines on when this may actually be something the public uses?
Yeah, we're not sure yet. They're hoping to roll it out for public testing at some point in the near future. And so it would be through the app stores that people use for their particular device. But I think, it's going to have a pretty long testing phase to make sure that, it's working as we expect it to work and have, whatever limitations there are, those are noted appropriately. And I think what else I would say is, it just gives us another chance to reach people as well with public safety information. One of the things that we try to do is we want people to understand, see the forecast and understand what a rip current is, how to get out of one, what you should do if you have a loved one caught in one. And, we can get that information to people maybe before they get to the beach. But, the next time we have maybe to share that is people have their phone out and maybe they use this app and they can say, oh, I want to learn more about rip currents. And that provides another means to just reach the public and hopefully get life-saving information to them.
Is it going to be, or is it already being tested on the East Coast? Because I can imagine that the rip currents look different on different coastlines, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, that's one of the challenges with any of these AI approaches is that You can train it in one place where rip currents might look a certain way. If you bring it somewhere else, does it work correctly, or do you need additional data? And generally, you want more data. And so we've done some testing on the East Coast. We actually started when this first prototype. We worked with some lifeguards in North Carolina, and they did some initial testing for us on the East Coast. So we tested it in different locations. But I think as it continues to progress and as we collect more and more data, it will continue to get better in terms of being used in different locations.
Well, I am a frequent beachgoer of South Carolina where there are no lifeguards. So if you ever need somebody to test it out here, I'm happy to do that.
For sure. Great. We'll take you up on that for sure.
Greg, is there anything else you want to add about RipFinder or your research in general?
Well, I guess I would just say, I think this type of research, just points to the value of NOAA and what we're able to do by not just providing public safety information, but working with, academic, nonprofit, private industry partners and fund really innovative work like this, which otherwise might not be possible. So, we're able to make, I think, really important advancements with our partners and hopefully then that information benefits the public and increases awareness about hazards like rip currents and reduces drownings and potential fatalities.
Yeah, I've heard that theme over and over again in the last several interviews I've done, is the value of the academia, private, public sector all working together. It seems like everybody brings something really important to the table and that everybody has a weakness, and so it balances out.
Yep, definitely.
Awesome. Greg, thank you so much for your time today.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.